Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies. My name's Jules Winterton. I'm director here, and I want to thank you for being here this evening to witness the launch of IALS Digital. Before introducing Steve Whittle, who's director of IALS Digital, I just wanted to say a few words without the aid of digital technology. And I've got to say, I'm really full of admiration for those who, in the context of this event, place their trust in the technology to work all the way through, but I'm sure it will. I wanted to tell you that this is an exciting time for the Institute in lots of ways. We're celebrating our 70th anniversary as a national legal research facility and resource. And we've had various events over the past couple of 3 weeks, and will have over the next 2 or 3 weeks, to help us celebrate that anniversary. Professor Ashiagbor gave her inaugural lecture just a few days ago as Professor of Law and Director of Research here at the Institute. The Information Law and Policy Centre is holding its annual lecture and annual conference all day tomorrow on the topic of children and digital rights. On the 21st of November, we're having an event to celebrate the contribution of the Institute to legal scholarship, and in particular concentrating on the pioneering and long-standing series of legal workshops, now known as the W.G. Hart Legal Workshops, and bringing together the academic directors from many institutions around the UK who've contributed to that series over the years. And I do urge you to pick up one of these sheets, which are just over on this table, as you go out, because it lists all these various events. There's one other I should mention, which is the Sir William Dale Centre for Legislative Studies, and they are holding their annual conference on the 1st of December on the legislative aspects of, you guessed it, Brexit. Yeah, Brexit. Now, there are some information panels just on either side of us here, and when you get the chance and when we're finished up, do have a look at them. They help us look back at the development of the Institute from its very small beginnings. I mean, we're still quite small, but really the earliest beginnings, the earliest accommodation, a small terraced house around on the other side of Russell Square. And we can look back on the achievements of the Institute with some pride. But we also need to look forward and look to the future, and further developments and a continuing role in the legal research landscape. And in particular, we're looking forward to a major refurbishment of this building, which will take place from the middle of next year, although we shall stay open throughout, so never fear. Could be a bit of noise. So that's going to be a major renewal for the Institute, and we're really looking forward to that. And I wanted to say how much we appreciate the support we receive from our colleagues all around the UK and internationally indeed. The support we receive from the University of London and the School of Advanced Study and our fellow institutes, which really give us our reason for existence. Now, it's also, of course, an exciting time because we're here for the launch of IALS Digital. And we have that launch this evening, which brings together the staff of our information systems team, our specialist legal information staff in the library and others. And it brings together a tremendous range of activities and services in digital legal scholarship, which they undertake and have undertaken over these many years, but this will give the focus and I hope the springboard for offering services throughout the research community. So to tell you more about that, I'm going to hand over to Stephen Whittle, and thank you.
Thank you, Jules. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to IALS Digital this evening. What we're going to be doing in the sessions is I'll give you a quick look at the sorts of work that we have been doing, things that we plan to do, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues who will be on two panels, one of them looking at the collaboration work that we've been involved with, initiatives that have been based on library collections, and then a second panel which will look at our commitment to open access and the different open access resources that we've been developing so far and intend to develop in the future. And then there'll be an opportunity to continue the discussion with the wine reception, which will be in the conference room just along the corridor. What is IALS Digital? Well, we anticipate that it's going to involve working in the cloud, and that it might involve cloud computing, that it might well involve new ideas, working in new ways, working together in new ways. And what we anticipate is that the work that we've done so far is really just the beginning of many new possibilities, and we're positioning ourselves to take advantage of those possibilities. It's a new name for established and evolving digital services at the Institute. It brings together several resources that we've developed, and we are working on new versions of those resources, which will have cross-searching facilities, and it brings together literally looking at some print resources and electronic resources at the same time. It's also, IALS Digital, an opportunity for new legal information initiatives, research projects and partnerships, and primarily it's our way of supporting digital legal scholarship, as Jules was saying. So to do that, IALS Digital is a service, it's a team, it's a set of resources. And I think it's characterised particularly by these two words, connections and collaboration. That's what we're involved with, connecting people to legal information, connecting people to each other, and collaborating, allowing ourselves to connect with various bodies and other scholarly organisations across the country and around the world to develop the resources that we're offering freely to the community. IALS Digital as a service is about developing and delivering freely available legal research resources on the web, exploring new technology and investigating its application for legal research, providing new content which very much builds on and draws on the unique collections of the library, and linking data, looking at adding value to resources which are already available, and importantly, skill sharing. So taking the expertise of the staff here and offering training sessions which will be focused on digital possibilities and use of new applications. IALS Digital as a team, well, here we are, Lindsay and I and myself, we are the team formerly known as Information Systems, and now IALS Digital. We are not alone, we are very much part of a bigger group of colleagues who are working in the library, other sections of the library, particularly the library's academic services team, in building content and developing new services, trying to keep things up to date. We're also very much collaborating with the Institute's academic staff and admin staff and colleagues wider within the School of Advanced Study and with the University of London Computing Centre. And then more widely of that, the string of acronyms, Bailey, FORM, the Free Access to Law Movement, of which we are a member, FLAIR, the Foreign Law Research Group of Libraries, and LMC Digital are all groups that are like-minded groups involved in open access or involved in digital resources that we have been involved with and we intend to be involved with to in a closer extent in the future. IALS Digital as resources, the resources we've developed so far, which are available and probably familiar to you. Some of those are award-winning, which have been recognised by the profession, by the British and Irish Association of Law Librarians, have been very kind in awarding us prizes for the developments that we've done so far. We're working on new versions of each of those resources, which will have new opportunities and new options within them. David's going to talk more about some of them, about currently legal research topics and about Lawport. In our second panel, we'll be looking also at open access and the journals that we've been developing, and the newest development, which is the open access book platform. What do we mean by digital legal scholarship? Well, really digital techniques and methods for legal research. So we see these as beneficial for the research process itself and essential for research outputs and publication. And that means we're looking at things like the application of technology that's been established in other disciplines and seeing how that might be applied to legal research, looking at open source software and platforms and resources, looking at different ways of data collection, methods and analysis, creating tools for locating information and giving access to new content. And part of that is around facilities to reuse, to adapt and adopt, to present information. And underpinning all of that is opportunities for online engagement and interaction with the community, and for offering ways to explore laterally new ideas. And social media is one way that we see that people's initial ideas could be tested. We encourage our PhD students, if they've got an idea they want to test, to put that out onto a blog or onto social media and see what the response is and whether that is beneficial to their work. Looking and thinking of the 70th anniversary, I did want to refer back to one of the earliest information projects that the Institute was involved with, which was the collation of legal research, which began life as a few full-cut, manually typed pages, and has been maintained since then in different ways, and it eventually formed a publication, which was a collection of research that had been completed. When we turned this into a database, that's when we were able to see the benefit of digital resources. When you put information together, it becomes more than the facts that are in there originally. So you're seeing what I'm describing as a digital benefit. You can get adjacent information, you get creative sparks, new ideas, new insights, and new knowledge from doing that, putting it in that new form. The work that we're going to see and my colleagues are going to talk about, one example I wanted to mention quickly is the case papers that we digitised for the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. What this is, I think, is a model of the way that we've been working with Bailey, where we've had a digitisation project. The digital objects are in Bailey and freely available in there. On the Institute's website, we develop visualisations to present access to that information in different ways. So you can look geographically at hotspots of the countries that are represented in that collection and link through to Bailey that way. Another project, which is a digitisation project, which Greenleaf is going to be talking about on a video that I'll be playing a little later, is the foundation of the Common Law Library. And we, both Bailey and IALS Digital, have contributed already to the prototype of this project. We've supplied digital copies of reports from Ceylon, Barbados and Jamaica, which will be contributing to this collection of materials which come up to about 1900, 1914, and they're looking at providing free open access to resources which give that history of the common law and how it has been adapted and adopted around the world. The open access journals that we have, Ronan's going to talk about the Student Law Review later on. We have 3 of those, and we're in discussion about a possible 4th one joining those journals. And collectively, we worked out that about 1.5 million views and downloads is the lifetime use of those journals so far. So the idea of open access and reaching out to a wider audience and dissemination is borne out by the response that we're having to that collection of journals. The Open Monograph project is our latest initiative in collaboration with colleagues in the school and particularly at the Institute of Historical Research. I wanted to take this opportunity to mention everybody who's helped us with that project, and particularly the editorial board and the advisory board, and particularly our first author, Stephen Mason, who is an Associate Research Fellow of the Institute, who has been incredibly supportive of the open access agenda, helping us take this from an idea to a project and now to a service. And finally, from me, just to say, I was mentioning that IALS Digital is about connections and collaboration. These are opportunities for people to become involved with what we're doing and to stay connected with what we're doing. And this is the group of social media resources that we have available. So if you like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, you will find out more about our developments as we go forward. I'd now like to hand over to David G, who's the Deputy Librarian here at the Institute, who's going to tell us about the context in which IALS Digital has been developed.
Thanks very much, Steve. That's very kind. Hello, everybody. As Steve said, my name is David G. I'm the Deputy Librarian here at IALS. As a way of putting the launch of IALS Digital into context this evening, I wanted to talk a little bit about the growth of IALS Library over the past 70 years and its development of a wide range of digital initiatives over the past 30 years. After many years of discussion and encouragement by senior legal figures in government, academia and profession, IALS opened its doors in 1947 as a national and international centre for the advanced study of law. From the start, IALS was based within the University of London, but it was always nationally funded to provide a free national legal research collection for all postgraduates, researchers and academics, based at the law faculties across the UK and overseas. On opening, IALS Library started with just 11,000 volumes and a focus on collecting foreign, international and comparative research materials. And by the end of 1947, it had attracted only 112 library members. IALS Library collections and membership grew rapidly though, and IALS expanded into 26 Russell Square in 1954. By the early 1960s, it was clear that a larger and more modern space was needed to house our growing collections and to meet the research and seating needs of our expanding readership. IALS moved into 17 Russell Square, this building, in April 1976, and the library was allocated 5 purposely designed floors in the new modern building. During the period 1976 to 2017, IALS Library delivered a number of significant achievements. It continued to receive national funding and to act as the de facto National Legal Research Library. Many of its library staff were awarded national and international awards for its work and projects. By 2016, IALS Library was registering over 5,200 members a year, and PhD students, researchers and academics were still in the majority, but other key user groups were becoming more important, particularly the 2,000 LLM students registered at the major University of London colleges, and the 100 students registered at IALS itself. By 2016, the library's foreign, international and comparative research materials had grown enormously and is now 312,000 volumes and includes a unique specialist legal education archive. And in a special concordant, the British Library had acknowledged that our extensive legal research collections were, quote, a major national resource in support of academic research in their field, unquote. IALS Library, like many libraries, also subscribe to increasing numbers of commercial legal research databases, e-journals and e-books, which it made available to users via its web catalogue. The library created a new group training room on our 4th floor, and staff now train well over 2,000 researchers a year in legal information research using a variety of methods, such as hands-on group sessions in our training room, one-to-one reference advice sessions, and online tutorials over the web. In its role as the de facto national law library, the library has also been keen to create free digital initiatives for the UK legal research community. It's developed open access initiatives such as projects to digitise some of the rare legal materials in our collections and make them freely accessible via our library catalogue. A recent example of this was the digitisation of the case papers of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council Appeals, which was undertaken with funding from the School of Advanced Study. IALS Library has also been keen to take part in collaborative ventures. A good example of this was our role as a founding initiator of the Bailey Legal Gateway, which continues to be hosted here at IALS. Bailey provides free online open access to the full text versions of UK legislation and law reports and much more. And in 2016-17, it had over 58 million page views. IALS Library staff have used their expertise to develop a number of award-winning legal research tools. And I have on this screen 2 of the most popular examples. The current legal research topics database contains details of PhD and law theses which are currently underway in universities across the UK. Its purpose is to provide postgraduate students, their supervisors and law schools with a comprehensive listing of legal research currently undertaken at doctoral level. And the FLAIR Index to Treaties database provides details of over 2,000 of the most significant multilateral international treaties and a number of important bilateral treaties, with web links to the full text of the treaty provided where available. And finally, IALS Library staff have recently created free, self-paced online legal research training tutorials on the School of Advanced Studies Fort platform. Using the Articulate software, their in-depth knowledge of legal information and materials, and their experience of creating and providing training for researchers, library staff have published 3 web tutorials. These are primarily designed for postgraduates and researchers, and we hope to publish more soon. So just to conclude, the many digital legal information initiatives developed by IALS Library over the past 30 years have in fact grown out of the expertise of library staff, their in-depth knowledge of the library's national collection of paper and digital materials, and their long experience of creating and providing training for postgraduates and researchers. These 3 key elements will, I'm sure, continue to be contributed by library staff to IALS Digital in the years ahead. Thank you very much. I will now introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Catharine MacMillan from the Dixon Poon School of Law at King's College London, who will be speaking to us about the value of IALS digital initiatives for her own research.
It's really important tonight to recognise the invaluable contribution that has been given to legal scholars, and I think to some extent to historians, by the digitisation project here. And what I wanted to do is to speak a little bit about what this has done in relation to my own research. Now, I first became aware of the wealth of the scholarship, or at least the materials that availed itself of further scholarship here, when I was taken down to the depository. I view the depository as a form of Aladdin's cave of materials, and I was looking for possibly a paragraph of information in about 8 feet of bound volumes. And so I said to the librarian, if you take me down, it'll probably be quicker than if you keep bringing these volumes up. And while I was there, what my eye caught was the title on the spine of a volume that said West Kootenay Power and Light Company. Now the West Kootenays, those are just to the west of the East Kootenays, for those of you who are wondering. West Kootenay Power and Light Company was built to service originally the mining town of Rossland, and this then extended to the town of Trail, which under Teck Resources still has the world's largest non-ferrous lead and zinc smelter. Now, why is this interesting and significant? Well, what it's interesting is that in a dispute that would arise in southeastern British Columbia about the exploitation of resources and the contractual implications of this, that it would end up in London. Now, in the depository, these are interesting, but not nearly as useful as they've become now, because what the digitization project does, what I have been working on in particular are the papers of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. Now, in a large scale, I'm trying to work out how this court functioned and what it did. This was a court which in its modern form was established in 1833. It had a small domestic jurisdiction of rather odd bedfellows, things like ecclesiastical law, admiralty prize patents, the Endowed Schools Amendment Act jurisdiction, but overseas had an enormous global reach. Very little is known about this court or really how it functioned. There are 3 or 4 monographs, there are a series of articles, many scholars have looked at particular areas. In looking through the materials, all sorts of things become apparent. Now, one of the reasons I think there's so little scholarship about this is this court has a very important legacy throughout the British Commonwealth, but the scholars who are interested in that are in those parts of the British Commonwealth, and of course the records are here in London, and the scholars here in London are largely not interested in something that actually happened somewhere else. So one of the things about this digitization project, which is super, is it takes the materials to the people who are interested in it. The second thing that has been a problem with the Privy Council papers over the last sort of decade that many of you will be aware of is that when the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council outlasted the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords, who would have predicted that one, and the House of Lords became, of course, the Supreme Court, they had to close the office on Downing Street, which is now used for another purpose, no point discussing that. And the records disappeared into storage, where they have been for quite some time now. So they are actually extraordinarily difficult to access in their whole anyway. So what have I used these records for, and what have I done with them? Well, I have looked at a number of cases, sometimes to look at the particular case and set it in the context. So those of you in the room who are lawyers will have heard, possibly from your contract lecturer, of the case of Dunlop and Selfridges, where Viscount Haldane in that case said that English law recognized effectively no third-party right, that a third party to a contract couldn't enforce a right. What probably very few of you know is that in the exact same week, the same law lord, Viscount Haldane, in a Judicial Committee of the Privy Council case called Robinson and the Grand Trunk Railway of Canada, gave a decision in which a contract between 2 people, the owner of a horse and the railway company, effectively completely bound the rights of the man who traveled with the horse, who had no contract with the railway company, in order to sue the company for negligence. The railways company's negligence permanently disabled this man. He was a working man. I suspect he never worked again. He was helping a friend in the transportation of this horse. Now, how exactly did this happen? Well, it's a very mysterious case. I mean, it just disappears because it's awkward and inconvenient. I think the fact that it's Canadian is ancillary to this disappearance. But when you look at the papers, and the papers held here, and it's very interesting, I have been unable to establish this provenance, but I think that the papers were actually before one of the law lords on the panel. Why do I think this? Because of the notations that are made on the papers themselves. They indicate a judge and not a counsel, and very definitely somebody who is there, present at the hearing of the appeal. And it's when you begin to put the pencil marks together that you begin to understand certain things. The basic problem is that the railway company's contract was established by an Act of Parliament. And so the panel themselves appear confused as to whether this is legislation binding this man, or whether how, because this doesn't work in English law, he's bound by the contract of other parties. But as you begin to look at the pencil marks through these documents, a rationale unfolds. They think it probably an act of Parliament. When you look at the pencil marks, the way they bind the man is to say, well, clearly the friend who bought the ticket must be acting as an agent. And you can look at this, portions of the transcripts are there, because in looking at the materials that are filed, we have the case for the appellant, the case for the respondent, we have portions of the transcript, we have all the relevant documents that were entered as exhibits at trial, so a copy of the contract itself. So what does this tell us all? Well, in this case, it tells us that the doctrine of privity was probably not as firmly entrenched as the earlier House of Lords case that week would indicate. It also indicates here a very deliberate transmission of English legal culture to Canada, because working men in England were, how shall I suggest this, not quite as well protected as they were in, say, the United States. And Canada, in choosing between these two norms, the courts in Canada are actually concerned to uphold the rights of the working man in much the same way that that would have been the case across the border in the United States. There are also practical problems here. The railways interface and join each other. But you have English law lords that are moving against this now, of course, at the suggestion of the railway company. Another interesting thing about this, who owned the shares in this railway company? The railway shares, of course, were owned by largely Britons, the Grand Trunk Railway of Canada. For those of you who are keen watchers of Downton Abbey, you will recall that it is on the breaking of the Grand Trunk Railway that Lord Grantham loses all his money. So we have here a court that interfaces with these different sort of social and economic realities here in England, and it's looking at the materials on the digitization project that this all becomes apparent. Now, another case, I've got about 3 minutes. I can take you through two other significant cases you can find here. Another case that's significant. There is a case in Canada, the Persons case. It's the case that was brought by 5 women from Alberta to establish that within the British North America Act 1867, women were people. Female persons were also persons. This is why it's called the Persons case. If women were persons, they could sit in the Canadian Senate. Now, it is in London that Viscount Sankey effectively holds that women under the Canadian Constitution, at any rate, are persons, and they are able to participate fully in the political process. This is in 1929, not long after female suffrage in Canada. Now, the thing that's very interesting about this is Viscount Sankey describes the Canadian Constitution as a living tree. It doesn't matter what happened in London when Sir Francis Riley drafted this legislation. It doesn't matter when the Imperial, that is to say the British Parliament, passed it, what they thought. What matters is the context in which this is heard. Now, the papers that are here at the Institute and are digitized indicate that the principal argument on behalf of the Attorney General was that this was never within the intention of the founders, that women were persons, and so consequently they were excluded from this. Now, what does this mean by looking at these papers and examining the extent of the argument? Canada, from this point and through the Privy Council, takes a very different turn than in the United States, where original intent matters, and we can see this by examining. There's a very conscious rejection of this argument. One last case that is not Canadian. One of the leading cases in contract law that many of you will recall, perhaps lecture on, is Pawan and Lau Yu Long, the famous Privy Council case from Hong Kong, where the Pawan family enters into a contract with the Lau Yu Long family. I won't explain that it takes about half an hour to work out how this happened, but in the initial arrangement, the Pawan family go away and suddenly realize they've entered into an incredibly bad bargain. And so they go back and they extract another bargain, and all of this arrives in London with the question, is this second bargain enforceable as a contract or not? Now, one of the things that I found really, really intriguing about this is I could never work out how these sharp and astute business people ended up in such a crummy bargain at the beginning. It's just so evidently a bad bargain, why did they agree? Well, the papers here at the Institute contain the answer, and the answer is that they didn't speak English. And the original negotiations were conducted partly in Cantonese, partly in English, and the written documents that they signed were in English, and that's wherein the bad bargain was contained. Now, as near as I can tell, this issue was never raised at any point in litigation. And one last useful thing, if you look carefully in the papers that are on the digitized project here, you will discover the address of this building. And if you go to the very far reaches of the new territories on the MRT system, you can find the building as I did. It's on Pawan Street. Thank you.
And It's now my pleasure to introduce our final speaker on this panel. Joe Urey is the Executive Director of Bailey, and he's going to be talking to us about Bailey and the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council newspapers. Joe.
Good evening. Many of you might already be aware of Bailey and have seen this welcoming homepage for Bailey. We indeed have the Privy Council case papers, but along with that we have many other things. And from the front page, you can go to the what we call our database page. And on that database page, you'll see more than 72, 73 different databases that cover all sorts of jurisdictions and all sorts of courts. And that includes, just recently, we included the judgments, the Supreme Court judgments and the Court of Appeal judgment for St. Helena, which was quite interesting. The person that requested that we put them on actually made a trip to the Institute. It took him 5 days in a boat, and then another day and a half by air from the Cape. And on his return journey, he was happy to tell me that their new airport has just been opened, and it took him about 3 days to get back. So he was quite thrilled, although he says the airport is very dodgy and he wouldn't recommend anybody land there. So. But that kind of is a theme that goes with Bailey, and that is that we started Bailey, and one of the things that we didn't realize when we started Osley originally years ago was that it would attract all sorts of people that want to put things on your databases. And indeed, every day, or not every day, but every week, I get somebody requesting us to put more of a collection on. The pensions regulator today, just before I came down here, said, can we have all of our pension regulators, the first tier tribunals for the pension regulator, can we have all of their judgments on Bailey? And let's make one thing clear about Bailey. Bailey seems like a great thing. We do a lot of work and so forth, but it actually is comprised of 3 people, 2 full-time people and 1 part-time people. So when people call up and ask for the secretary, I've given up trying to explain that. I just say, yes, you're speaking to the secretary, including the accountant or whatever they ask for the person. Luckily, we have a technology person, and so he's the person that he takes the calls for anything that's technical. And that includes, he's the developer, and he's also the systems manager, and so he wears several hats too. The one thing that has kind of overtaken us, and the Privy Council papers are a good example of it, is the amount of feedback we get and questions. And so once we start a database like this, we oftentimes think about, well, getting it on the computers, getting it accessible to people, that's the job. But really what's grown up over the years is the amount of work that comes along with putting those things up on the paper. So instantly we get from all over the world questions about Privy Council papers, and including the missing ones. I was just talking before the meeting with there's a missing Manitoba paper from one of the collections in Canada, and it's kind of given rise to all sorts of conspiracy theories because nobody has it, nobody in Canada. The Inns of Courts don't have it. We don't have it. We have the gap. We have all the other papers, and then the gap, and it's in an index, but it's not there. So everybody's quite interested in it. I shouldn't say everybody, but some people are quite interested in this. And so I periodically get another email from British Columbia saying that he's on the track and he's got closer to it. The thing about the Privy Council papers is they cover such an incredible amount of detail about different aspects. And I've got a listing here of some of the things it has. They talk about ancestral land, inheritance, disputes using Mohammedan law, large commercial cases involving hydroelectric power and mining interests in Australia and Canada, press and publishing disputes, personal injury, breach of contract, insurance cases, workers' compensations, licensing of a pub in Adelaide is an example, patents, matrimonial and family, liability for fire damage, wills and probate. And that's not to mention the other things of the prize reports and the other ancillary things that came with the Privy Council. And so on the Bailey database, you'll see cases that cover all those things, and they'll come from all those different areas, as you know, Canada, Australia, India, Far East, Africa, West Indies. And so you can imagine when we get feedback questions, they come from all these places, and that's part of the reason Bailey's simple design is we don't have cookies, and we don't have any kind of JavaScript or anything else. We try to make it as stripped down as possible because we're aware that people from all over the world are using this, and they're not always going to be up to date in the most recent technology. And so we have a constant battle going with people trying to get us to update the database, and people telling us it looks old and so forth. And so we're looking at a compromise now that we can keep that original idea, but maybe make it look a little jazzier for people. One of the other projects we had right at the beginning of Bailey was we thought it would be a good idea to find out from legal practitioners or legal academics around the country, find out what their case list would be in the kind of traditional legal courses. And so we did a great survey all around Britain and asked different academics if we could have their reading lists of cases. And what came out of that is a list of subject areas. And in each one of those lists, or list as near as we could get, all the cases that were in their combined reading lists. And so that's become a resource. One of the good things about Bailey is that the URLs, the links to the cases, are quite easily linked to and embedded in your documents. So if you want to put together a document that's going to be on the web, it's quite easy to have it automatically generate the URLs to it in the documents. There's a script for it there. One of the other well, just to show you the range of our Judicial Committee and Privy Council decisions, and quite a number of those have the full collection of papers that go with it. Here's the case, the person's case that was just mentioned. And that's the listing on the Bailey of all the papers that go with it. And you can click through. And as was mentioned, they oftentimes have the marginal notes that somebody's made in them and quite interesting things, maps, graphs, so forth. Oftentimes, for example, in this people's case, they rely on some legislation, and that's also to be found on Bailey too. There's another case that's in the Privy Council ones, Diggs and H.G. Wells. It's a copyright problem. And again, there's the full papers that go with that. And there's other cases that are well known. Some of them, like this case here, where we've where we've taken the time to actually get the full text in and converted it to HTML to a web version. And there, the links that are found there are all highlighted. And so any of those links that you wish to look at, you can go through and see the case that's mentioned there. This is where I close the whole browser instead of just one of the other aspects of being part of the wider the family, or the free access to law family, is that we can do things in collaboration with others. And one of the tools that has come about is this tool called the Law Site. So if you go to our search page, you'll see up here, you can do a search in Law Site. Now what Law Site does is quite incredible. It searches across all the jurisdictions that the Lee family cover. So let's I'll put in this well-known one, and you'll see what's listed there. It'll give you, along this side, you'll see the different countries that are indicated, and it'll show all the cases that cite that case. Throughout the world, basically. Australia, New Zealand, sometimes Hong Kong, Singapore. It also gives articles that are cited. And that's basically, to a large extent, I can't get that for you. It's basically relies on the collection of journals that comes from Australia, because the Australian university system, they've retained their copyright to their own journals, and so they're able to put them online, where so many other places in the world it's been given to a commercial organization to publish their journals, and then so we don't get access to them. Another, if I'm just one last thing. When talking about collections, I always like to point out that Scotland has been very nice to us. And they've gone and they've given us all their Court of Sessions judgments, and it also includes a lot of House of Lords judgments too, right back to the year. There you can see a selection of it. And this, I must say, it gets a lot of requests on our feedback. As I mentioned before, this one comes mainly, all these requests are from historians that want to know about why is it that there's a case for example, there's a case that I always liked in the Court of Sessions way back in the year 17-something, where a person had rented an elephant from London, and when it got up to Scotland, it didn't perform the tricks that they kind of would. And you people are legally minded, you know what would ensue then, you know. And so, and a historian now can find out how much it would cost to rent an elephant in 1735 or whatever from London and transport it to Scotland, and what to expect if it didn't do the tricks. I'll leave you with that. And definitely, I invite you to take a browse. There's, forget how many, I think it says up here, I think 30 or 40,000 Scottish cases there, so, take your time.
The final bit of this first panel is the video recording a message from Graham Greenleaf from Ostley.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First, I'd like to extend best wishes from Austley's co-directors, Professor Andrew Mowbray and Dr. Philip Chung. They send their apologies. They would have liked to have been here this afternoon, but they're out of town today. But Austley is very grateful to be asked to participate in this launch of IALS Digital. Austley has worked with IALS for nearly 20 years. My speech for the Free the Law event that started Bailey was in fact written at IALS. We've had since then very close and continuing collaboration between Austley and Bailey, and we're always extremely impressed by Bailey's amazing achievements with a very small staff. IALS has also been the UK base for the Commonwealth Legal Information Institute, or commonly, and that will become an even more important relationship in the near future. Having a look through the exciting range of projects that IALS Digital is already planning to undertake, I'd like to particularly commend two of them, two important open scholarship initiatives, the 3 open access journals and the Observing Law series of new monographs. Sourcing and publishing new commentary for free access is a very important task that I expect that other legal information institutes will be undertaking in the near future, and it's good to see IALS Digital taking a lead on that. Now, finally, I'd like to inform you about a very new Austley initiative which will involve close cooperation between Austley and IALS Digital. Last Friday, Austley received a $500,000 grant from the Australian Research Council, complemented by matching funds from 11 Australian universities. The purpose is to build an online library called Foundations of the Common Law 1215 to 1914, to be based on commonly. The aim is going to be to digitise the key pre-1915 case law and other materials from across the whole common law world, in cooperation with 12 legal information institutes, including IALS Digital and Bailey, and you can see the logos of many of those other collaborating LIIs behind me. As I demonstrated in a seminar at IALS last October, the partner LIIs already hold about 250,000 pre-1915 cases, and we're hoping to double that in the course of the Foundations project. So we're looking forward very much to working with IALS Digital to ensure that many of the rare legal sources from across the Commonwealth that are found in the IALS library can be digitised for inclusion in this project. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say congratulations to IALS, to Jules Winterton, Stephen Whittle, Joe Urey and all your colleagues for continuing advances in free access to law. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you have a most successful event.
What I'd like to do now is invite our second panel to join us, and look taking the lead from Graham at those open access initiatives. Introduce our first speaker, Professor Jane Winters from the School of Advanced Study, and Jane is Professor of Digital Humanities.
Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be here. I've had the pleasure to work with Steve and his colleagues on some of their open access initiatives. They really are doing amazing work. I'm just going to talk very briefly about the wider context into which all of this work fits. You'll have heard from the projects that have been described so far that openness and accessibility have been built into the work here at IALS since the beginning, before open access was described in the formalised terms that we talk about it now. That kind of open access, that very formalised open access that fits into all kinds of government mandates about publishing and so on, has actually been with us rather longer than most of us think. It seems to have been something that we've been exercised about for the last 5 years or so, but you can see from this description of it behind me, this was a statement from the Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2002, which really set out, this is what the broadest kind of open access looks like. Most people don't publish open access to this extent, as you can say at the end. The only constraint on reproduction and distribution, and the only role for copyright in this domain, to be to give authors control over the integrity of their work and the right to be properly acknowledged and cited. Everything else, all bets are off, you can do what you like with it. Very few people do that, but the work here is sort of in the middle of that spectrum of open access, I think. So why is open access important? It's important for lots of different groups. It's important for authors, first of all, and most of us have these multiple roles actually as authors, editors and readers. But as authors, it opens up your research to completely new kinds of audience, from the interested public to policymakers to journalists. And that obviously feeds into all kinds of things like the impact agenda, that is something else that exercises us these days. And it makes your work accessible globally, irrespective of ability to pay. And that democratisation of access that we were just hearing about in lower resource environments where they can't pay for access to these materials is incredibly important, particularly if your research, for example, deals with human rights in the developing world. You want people there to be able to access that material freely and easily. And it vastly increases the potential and actual readership for your research. As you heard from Steve's figure of 1.5 million views and downloads for the SAS Open Journal since they were launched. Those figures are really amazing, I think. So it certainly increases downloads and views. The jury's out on whether it increases citations, but the general feeling is that it probably does. There are some conflicting research around this, but it does seem that more than likely, and it will increase over time, that being open increases citations. And finally, I think it supports imaginative engagement with your work. If people who wouldn't normally have had access to it can suddenly read and think about it, they might do things that you wouldn't have thought about yourself. And that kind of opening up of opportunity and kinds of engagement is something that I think is really exciting about open access. And on the reader side of the equation, even really well-resourced universities don't pay for subscriptions to everything. So there's always something that you can't access, even if you're in somewhere like Oxford or Cambridge. So this, again, equalises the field and opens things up to people. And it removes not just the financial barriers, but the technical ones. You can get to things easily. You don't have to go through multiple gatekeeping systems in order to arrive at where you want to be. You can download a PDF very easily. And access to that previously gated knowledge, I think, is increasingly important in the early 21st century because we need the peer-reviewed research to be accessible while we have fake news circulating and people's critical thinking about easily accessible material is not as developed as it might be. So putting the really high-quality peer-reviewed research into the public domain is incredibly important. And that happens more quickly with open access too. So the stories that we want to tell and that we want people to hear are accessible more quickly and more easily. Why is it really important now? Well, this is based on the findings of the Academic Book of the Future project, which was reported in the Times Higher in June of this year, and it was headed Warning of Existential Crisis for Academic Books. When you read the figures, it is quite dramatic. When I started out in academic publishing, and you thought of around 300 copies being pretty good sales for an academic monograph. But you can see here, sales of academic books have declined by 13% in a decade between 2005 and 2014. But at the same time, the number of individual titles sold rose by 45%. So we're publishing a lot more, but the sales are declining. And that means that average sales per title are now 60. So that's the number of libraries that are buying a copy of an average monograph in the arts and humanities. And then picking into that further, the 2014 REF, only around 50% of books submitted to the REF sold at least one copy in 2008-14. So that means 50% didn't sell anything at all. So the access to monographs in particular, we talk a lot about journals with open access, but monograph access is really falling off the cliff, and open access is one way that we can counter that. So that's why it's really important to do it now, which is not to say that it's easy. The publishing landscape's evolving very quickly. What seemed cutting edge a couple of years ago isn't anymore, or something that was held out as this will be the great saviour, the big model for open access is proven a couple of years later. Actually, that doesn't really work. We need to go back and start again. There are risks for authors, I think. Long-term sustainability of many of these new open access platforms and publishers that are developing. We don't know how robust they are, and inevitably some of them are going to fail. So if you're committed to publishing open access, it's quite difficult to decide where to go to make sure that your research will remain accessible. And tied up with that, how do we know whether it's authoritative and trustworthy if you don't have a university press behind it? So how do people judge what's high quality material and what's not? How rigorous the peer review will have been? A lot of people have concerns about licensing and reuse. It's a complicated environment, so how do you know what you're signing up to? What kind of advice can you get? And there's also the problem of discoverability. The more stuff is open outside normal publishing channels, the harder it is to find. So, and you know, it's a truism that people don't look past the first couple of pages of a Google search. So if your book's not there, it can be open, but nobody's going to find it. And generally there's a lack of recognition sometimes for the different ways that different disciplines publish, and particularly the differences between the sciences and the humanities, and the importance in our disciplines of books, for example, not just journals. And I wouldn't say that IALS is addressing and solving all of these problems, but it's very much on the way to doing that. And it's providing publishing platforms that you know you can trust. They'll have the imprint of IALS with them. They'll guide you through the publishing process. And I think the focus on early career researchers for the journals is a wonderful example of mediating a very complicated publishing environment for people at a very anxious stage of their careers, and making sure that they can trust what they're doing and their work will remain available. And we're going to hear more about these two, the student journals and the open access book publishing. But coming back to that 60 figure for books, the two books that have been published by IALS Digital in its Observing Law series have had more than 3,000 downloads. So you can see immediately that that's reaching a much wider audience than it would ever have done if those books were just printed. So thank you very much.
I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Ronan, who's been very influential in the development of the IALS student law review.
Thank you, Steve. I was going to give a presentation, but after hearing that only 60 copies are sold, I feel really depressed with the idea of being an academic. I am going to give a very short presentation setting out an example of an open access journal, which is the Student Law Review here at IALS. So, the Student Law Review, it was set up a couple of years ago in 2013, and it is a journal which is run by students. So the editorial board are all students, all mainly PhD students. Sometimes I think we've had some master's students. We have had assistance from the academic staff here at IALS as well. So Dr. Stefano is our academic editor who helps out with the process. We've also had great assistance from the administration here in the library, especially Steve, who's been really excellent in processing all our documents and turning them into a form which can be put onto the website. So again, thank you for that, Steve. We produce 1 or 2 issues a year. Our reviewers and our authors are a mixture of students, PhD students, master's students, maybe even some undergraduate students, as well as being academics, so acting academics with permanent positions at universities. Our journal is based on an open access model, and you can have a look at the URL, and I think we've already seen some of it, and that sets out what gives a list of all the previous editions we've had, etc. What is the benefit of this? Well, there's quite a few benefits, I think, to students. So this isn't really so much about the open access. This is about the opportunity that the journal has given to us as students to develop ourselves. So the first thing, the main thing, is it just gives us practical experience in running an academic journal. So the networking skills involved to solicit reviewers, to get articles from different people, to interact with them. Then the organisational skills, which are keeping a track of who has sent an article, have you reviewed it, has it gone back to the author, has the author replied, is there some proofreading to be done? So there's a lot of skills involved in just managing that process. There's also, as I've discovered, a certain amount of diplomacy involved in the whole process, because you have to be very diplomatic. You have to recognise, first of all, that someone has sent you a piece of their work and they put a lot of effort into it, so you have to appreciate that and be grateful for that. But at the same time, you have to maintain a high quality journal, which means sometimes being critical of the work that you've been given and also rejecting it. So it's a new skill to learn, to be diplomatic and to navigate those relationships well. I see one of my former editors, Mazar, smiling because he's had all these same problems as well, Mazar. It's also really good for career development because it can lead on to further academic work. So I was the editor-in-chief of the Student Law Journal, and then I was involved in the editorial board for several years. And partly as a result of that, I'm now the editorial administrator of another journal, and I've used the experience of working in the Student Law Journal to my benefit, and that's helped me to develop and get a job working with another journal. And it also gives you a lot of familiarity with the academic publishing process. So knowing how it works and knowing the best way, if you want to get your article published in another journal, the best way to go about that. And that could be things like, I think that probably the key advice that I have learned is engaging with the peer review process. So as the editor, on the editor side, I can see that if someone doesn't bother engaging with the peer review process, then it's unlikely that we're going to publish the article because the author needs to address the criticisms that a peer reviewer has done. So that's now one of the things that I have learned. If I'm submitting an article and someone gives a negative review and peer review, I need to engage with it and deal with it in some way. Then, if I just conclude with the benefits of the open access model. Now, to be honest, Jane has already given all these benefits in much more detail than I have. But the key thing is about the lack of a barrier to accessing your article. You want your article to have the widest possible audience because you're writing something to be disseminated. You want people to read it. And if it's open access, then anyone can read it anywhere. Just this last couple of days, I've been doing a lot of proofreading work on a journal on South American legislation, and I said to the author, I sent an email saying, "Oh, we published an article on Brazilian legislation last year. Why have you not referred to that?" And then I realised it's because our journal is very niche, and it's not open access, and they won't have seen it. So that's a real disappointment for us because we have relevant stuff that we have written which is really relevant to these South American academics, but we haven't published it in a way that they can access. So that's a real, it's to the real detriment of our journal. I think the very important thing that Jane has touched on already is to balance up the need for open access, but against the need to maintain quality, and that's where the peer review process comes in, because you have to still make sure that the work that you are publishing is worthwhile. So it has to go through a peer review process. You have to be able to reject stuff which isn't good enough, and you also have to be able to give a critique or a suggestion for a way that you can improve it. I wasn't asked to talk about access more broadly to legislation, but I couldn't help but mention, because one of my key things that I do is involved with legislation. And I think we can look at three different things. We can look at access to academic journals and monographs, which is very important, but perhaps not critical to the end user. The key thing is access to case law and legislation, and I know that Bailey has done great work on the case law. With the legislation, I can't think of a more important thing for the rule of law, that we have access to the law which we are subject to. So that's why it's critical that Bailey in particular is producing the legislation. But I think even more importantly that the government is producing legislation on its website. And if you click on this link or follow this link if you want to, it's to an open access journal, I should add, and it talks about how we can access legislation and the different ways that we can determine if we have proper and full access to legislation. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce our final speaker on this panel, Professor Ashiagbor from the Institute here.
Thank you. I'd like to start by saying thank you so much to Steve, not just for organising this launch, but actually for leading the whole of the IALS digital team. And you've seen it throughout this evening, the amazing work that they've been doing, and also just pulling together, as David mentioned, more than 30 years worth of work, taking the librarianship skills, which they both have, and Steve didn't say when he started out as a law librarian, and bringing together traditional librarianship skills with the sort of new digital era. So I really want to say thanks to Stephen and his team. So what I want to talk about is continuing the conversation that Jane and Ronan started about open access, but then mentioning a couple of very specific developments in this institute in terms of open access monograph publishing and a new PhD prize that we're launching tonight. So Jane talked about the kind of quite long history of the idea of open access, and when you look at definitions of what people mean by open access, a really simple definition that's used within the School of Advanced Studies, the Humanities Digital Library, describes it as publication which gives individuals in libraries throughout the world access to content free of charge. That's the simplest definition I've come across. And a slightly more complicated definition would be to say open access is the ability of any prospective reader to freely access peer-reviewed publications via the internet without the need for personal or institutional subscription, or a special login, or a one-off payment, or any other barrier or restriction. So when put like that, either the simpler version or the more complicated version, which is talking about access to academic, and as Ronan said, peer-reviewed academic work, what's not to like about that? And so I just want to say a little bit about perspectives on open access from academics and from the institutions. And I think most academics support that principle of publicly funded research being freely available. And in a way, as I said, who's going to dispute that? There are lots of different types of terminology floating around, lots of different models, as Jane mentioned. And I just want to mention a couple of terminological differences. The language has been developed mostly talking about access to journal articles rather than access to books. And so journals talk about green open access and gold open access. So gold open access is used to describe a situation where a journal makes a peer-reviewed article freely available to the reader immediately. It's published. But the author has to have paid, or their institution has to have paid, what's known as an article processing charge. And that's known as gold open access. Another way of describing open access, green open access, is where a peer-reviewed article, PDF, is available immediately, is available on an institutional repository. So here in the School of Advanced Study we have the sort of SAS institutional space. But in order to protect the subscription revenue of the journal can say readers can access that article for free, but only after an embargo period of 12 months or 18 months. Because we want, if you pay for the journal, you can access that article immediately. you can read it for free, but only if you wait. And then there's other kinds of open access, platinum and so on. But I just want to get the idea of the reader paying through a subscription, or their library paying, or the author paying. And that's led to some concerns about the way, to that whole climate of what's not to like about open access. And it's certainly been encouraged both by government as a matter of policy, but also by the institutions in higher education in the UK. So there's lots of acronyms here. We have the Higher Education Funding Council for England and Wales, there's equivalent in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. And those institutions are changing from April 2018. We're going to have something called UKRI, UK Research and Innovation, and HEFC, the Higher Education Funding Council, is going to be folded in to another body. But basically, you've got funding body which funds universities to do research of about £3.6 billion a year. It used to fund teaching, and that was reduced. You also have research councils, Arts and Humanities Research Council, Economic and Social Research Council, Medical Research Council, they fund research. And those bodies have also set open access as a big thing. And as Jane mentioned, in order to get funding for research through the Research Excellence Framework, this time round, journal articles have to be open access, green or gold. Next time, in about, 10 years' time, monographs will also have to be open access. So there's this pressure, both because intellectually, people doing academic work want it to be read and accessed, as Ronan was saying, but also for public policy reasons. Why make it difficult for readers to access publicly funded research? But to get between the reader and the author, you have often commercial publishers who are not 100% benign, they're commercial publishers. And so part of what some academics feel about open access is, we really like the idea, but we haven't really done enough to be proactive to kind of bring about the model of open access we want to see. The commercial publishers, of course, they're publishing journals, they're publishing books, and commercial publishers have been incredibly active, and in particular pushing what looks more like a kind of gold open access. So sometimes commercial publishers will get subscriptions from libraries to subscribe to the journal, the hard copy and the electronic version, but they also get money from the authors who want readers to access that article immediately. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because what I think about, oh gosh, this is not, sorry. Just want to bring up the Humanities Digital Library within the School of Advanced Studies, so that's the of which the IALS Observing Book monograph series is part. Because I see open access being used as a way of launching a new generation of university presses, as partly as a response to the real desire to have books, journals available, but a concern that academics have been a bit slow off the mark, and commercial publishers have been really active, and perhaps universities need to do something to be active again in relaunching the old model of university presses like Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, Edinburgh University Press, but in a new era of digitisation. So I'm going to give you another example, which is Goldsmiths University Press. And a third example could be UCL Press. So what we see here in the School of Advanced Studies Humanities Digital Library, where two of the SAS institutes in particular, the Institute of Photography Research and this one, the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, have been at the forefront of coming together to publish a series of books. And for the IALS one, we're really pleased and delighted. Thank you, Stephen, for coming tonight. Stephen Mason has published our first two books, with Daniel Seng, Electronic Evidence, the 4th edition. That was in May this year. And last year, Stephen's co-authored Electronic Signatures in Law. That was...
That's my section.
Sorry.
And my journal, the Digital Evidence Electronic Signatures.
Yes, yes. So that was November 2016. So these two institutes have been at the forefront of coming together in what is very much like a university press, rather like the UCL one and the Goldsmiths one. So I just want to focus on the IALS side of this. So the idea is very much that it's a service, it's a platform, but it's also a publisher. And it adopts, as Jane was mentioning, a commons approach to publishing, in that publishers, so authors, will have their monographs published as a free-to-download PDF, which will look like an e-book, under a Creative Commons license, which means it's free for the reader to download, but there's an opportunity, if the reader wants, to have a physical copy, to request a print on demand to purchase at a price. So that's the model that the SAS Humanities Digital Library is following. To focus more on law, what we envisage the Open Observing book series to do is, when I think about, in other disciplines, they often have a hierarchy of journals, a hierarchy of publishers, and in law, we don't have an official hierarchy, but if you look at the monographs by legal scholars which have been most read, purchased, or certainly won book prizes for excellence in law, they tend to be published by Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, Hart Publishing, and then possibly Routledge. So Hart Publishing was founded by Richard Hart, who used to be the Senior Commissioning Editor for Law at Oxford University Press. Okay. What we'd really like to do with the Humanities Digital Library, the law part of it, is to be one of the top 4 publishers, or destination publishers, for legal scholars. Because, and this is kind of coming back to Ronan's point, because the peer review and the support that the editorial board and the advisory board provide you as an author, the support to revise, the constructive criticism of your manuscript is equivalent to the support and constructive criticism you get with a traditional university press. But at the end of the day, you don't have to rely on people being able to pay £75 to buy your hardback book. And just to underline that point about access and a new generation of authors, we're launching this IALS PhD Thesis Book Prize. And what we want to do with that is to offer a publishing contract for the doctoral thesis of a researcher, a legal researcher, doesn't have to be based in the UK, who's been awarded their doctorate in the past 2 years. And that will be by a competition. So obviously recent PhD, successful PhD students, or those who've just got their PhDs, can nominate themselves, submit a chapter of their thesis. It will be read by the editorial board of the Open Access Book Publishing, which comprises Steve Whittle, me, David G, Rosemary Hunter, who's Professor of Law at Queen Mary, Fiona Cowney, who's Professor of Law at Keele, and Richard Hart, who I mentioned, who's was founding owner of Hart Publishing, who's going to be our consultant editor. So the editorial board will be the judging panel for this book prize, and as I said, the prize will be a publishing contract for the best thesis, and hopefully within a year of the prize being announced in May, the book will be out. So I very much encourage you, or anyone who you know who has completed a PhD in the past couple of years, to very much think about submitting not the entire thesis yet, but submitting a chapter of that thesis to the PhD thesis prize. Thanks very much.